the number of deaths continues to be underreported.
This is currently the biggest threat that Canada faces.
There have been far too many deaths already in Canada.
The Canadian economy is experiencing significant and rapid contraction.
The federal government has already backstopped nearly 200,000 small business loans. Many small businesses complained they did not qualify.
We're asking for regular accountability session.
I'm instructing my administration to halt funding of the World Health Organization.
There is a need for international coordination, and the WHO is an important part of that.
You are seeing that curve bending.
It's Sunday, April 19th. I'm Mercedes Stephenson, and this is the West Block.
Our government will invest $1.7 billion to clean up orphan and inactive wells in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and BC. We're also working with BDC and EDC to expand credit support for at-risk medium-sized energy companies so they can maintain operations and keep their employees.
That was the Prime Minister late last week announcing funding for the oil and gas industry that has suffered from the economic fallout of COVID-19, as well as the oil production battle that was initiated by Saudi Arabia and Russia. Joining me now to discuss this bailout and the way forward is Natural Resources Minister Seamus O'Regan. Thank you so much for joining us, Minister.
Good to be back, Mercedes. Good to see you.
How are things out in Newfoundland and Labrador right now?
Hard. You have a province that is even more dependent, believe it or not, than the province of Alberta on oil revenues. And they have plummeted for the two reasons that you just cited. You have an industry that is suffering from demand devastation because we're not driving around anymore. We're not flying like we used to. So that's plummeted about 35%. And then this price war initiated by Saudi Arabia and Russia, which I think we've brought some stability to with a massive OPEC plus cut. But still, look at the prices of oil. I mean, you're talking about a barrel out west that's cheaper than a foot-long sub. I mean, that is dire. Nobody ever thought that we'd see those days. And here in Newfoundland, where it's Brent crude, it's less than half of what the provincial government was conservatively estimating. So these provinces are hard hit.
Absolutely brutalizing Newfoundland and Labrador as well as Alberta. Your government offering up some help this week, but many inside the industry are saying it's too little too late. What they really need is help covering off their capital costs, their operation costs, and their regulatory costs. Fixing wells doesn't do that. Why hasn't your government introduced money for those costs for oil companies?
Well, indeed, we have for small and medium-sized companies, and a lot of us, I think, when we think of the oil industry, think of big players, miles of pipeline. In my case, big offshore oil rigs worth billions of dollars. When in fact, 85% of the jobs are through small and medium-sized companies. So what we announced yesterday, there wasn't a price tag on it because there's no cap on liquidity, on the liquidity that we're offering. But we will be working with BDC and EDC, and I know with BDC, we're going to be targeting those companies that are between $15 and $60 million, and that's a huge swath of the oil industry. So, when I spoke with the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers for the first time when we were locked down, and I've spoken to them several times since, but in their first meeting, it was an open membership call, and they said of our top 5 asks, the top 3 are liquidity, liquidity, liquidity. I was on the phone with Tim McMillan, the CEO, last night, and they're very pleased with this as a first step. And we're working through the details on those liquidity measures with them. So that was very important. I know the headlines caught orphan wells, but the industry's, I think, relatively pleased with what we've done on liquidity. And like everything else we've done through this crisis, Mercedes, what we started out with and where we are now, we are constantly changing and tweaking. And that's from listening to stakeholders to make sure that we can improve these measures to make sure that they're effective.
Were there people inside the cabinet, Minister, who were against putting any money towards the oil and gas industry?
I think there's a great realization, firstly, that we are the 4th biggest oil producer in the world. That certainly came forward for me when I attended the G20 summit virtually like I am now. I attended it here in St. John's with colleagues from Saudi Arabia, Russia, China, and the United States. They wanted to know how Canada was doing. They wanted to know how, as a producing country, we are doing. So there's their weight of responsibility of knowing that you're the 4th largest oil producer in the world, that there are 576,000 jobs at stake. That you've got all these small and medium-sized businesses out west and out where I am from here, where I'm broadcasting from in St. John's, Newfoundland, which has been devastated by this.
Minister, I guess I'm wondering when that additional liquidity might be coming then, because there are still big oil companies that don't qualify. Canadian Chamber of Commerce is still saying this doesn't go far enough for what the industry needs to survive.
I think Minister Morneau is going to have, other announcements on that. But, again, for the small and medium-sized players, making sure, and this was the same, speaking with labor, speaking with unions, and a number of them came out yesterday saying they were pleased. Liquidity was important for them, too, because they need companies whole. They need companies, basically, to have the jobs for workers to come back to.
Is there a possibility that you would consider putting money into the Keystone XL pipeline, as Jason Kenney is doing?
Well, I have a very constructive relationship with Energy Minister Sonia Savage. I smile because today might be the first day that I haven't spoken to her on an almost daily basis in weeks, although the day is short, so I may end up speaking to her yet. That sort of relationship with her and the relationship I've had with natural resources ministers right across the country, but I would say particularly when talking about oil, Minister Savage, Minister Bronwyn in Saskatchewan, Minister Siobhan Cody in Newfoundland and Labrador have been tremendously important. And even going into meetings, as I have numerous times with the U.S. Energy Secretary over the past few weeks, to make sure that our efforts are dovetailing.
How do you balance out your priorities when your government has put so much emphasis on the environment, but there's also a call for oil and gas to be bailed out?
Well, I look back to February when I attended the Globe Conference, which is the biggest clean tech conference in North America in Vancouver. And I spoke very frankly there and said, there is no way that we are reaching net zero without Alberta. There is no way we are reaching net zero without Canadian oil and gas. And similarly, the next day when I flew to Calgary and co-hosted an innovation summit with Minister Savage, I said to the oil and gas companies who were there, you need net zero. And the reason being is that this is no longer just an environmental or climate change initiative. It has now become a strategy for economic competitiveness. What Mark Carney has been saying for a long time is right. Investment is changing. It is no longer going to change. It is changing. The market realizes that. Investment is looking for jurisdictions that take climate change seriously. They are looking for industries like ours that are working presently right now on electrification, on carbon sequestration, on basically decarbonizing a carbon extractive industry. And we can do it. We are doing it. We need to do a lot more, but we can't get there without one another. And that's my message to everybody.
Minister, we just have a few seconds left, but what do you say to Canadians who'd been hoping to travel to your part of the country for vacation, to Americans hoping to come up there who now don't know if they'll be able to take those summer vacations?
Well, yeah, it's tough because, we are a province that relies so much on tourism, and I am a man who's very proud of where he's from and loves showing the place off to people who I know, and sometimes people I don't know. I just bump into them on the street and say, how you doing, where can I point you? But we're going to have to see where we are with public safety. And I hope that, coming this summer, if nothing else, Newfoundlanders can enjoy a staycation. I'd like Canadians to enjoy a staycation out here, and I'm looking forward to when we can open ourselves up to the world again. That will be a happy day.
Okay, Minister, I think all of us are looking forward to that. Thank you for your time today and take care.
Thanks, Mercedes. Good to talk to you.
Up next, why COVID-19 is being called China's Chernobyl moment. Did Beijing engineer a cover-up, and how should Canada respond?
American taxpayers provide between $400 million and $500 million per year to the WHO. In contrast, China contributes roughly $40 million a year, and even less. As the organization's leading sponsor, the United States has a duty to insist on full accountability.
Welcome back. That was President Trump last week announcing he would cut funding to the World Health Organization while the U.S. reviews the international body's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic amid allegations of a cover-up by Beijing. On Friday, the Chinese government revised the death toll for Wuhan, increasing it by 50%. So, was there a cover-up by the Chinese government, and how should Canada respond? Joining me now is Irwin Cotler, chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights and former Liberal Justice Minister. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Cotler.
Good to be with you.
Sir, you are one of over 100 experts, academics, and political figures who have condemned China in a letter that blames the Chinese government and holds them responsible for the global COVID-19 pandemic. It talks about a deliberate cover-up in this letter, which you call China's Chernobyl moment. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, what we meant by it is that China's accountability arises from the fact, number one, that they sought to suppress information, in effect, to suppress the truth to begin with. Number two, that they both arrested and imprisoned medical doctors and dissidents who tried to sound the alarm. And number three, they've been engaged since then in a global disinformation campaign to cover up the truth and to cover up their accountability.
What do you think of the Canadian government's rather muted response to questions about the validity of China's numbers and their culpability in all this? At one point, the health minister, Patty Hajdu, suggested it was sowing conspiracy theories to question China's data.
Well, I understand why the Canadian government's position has been somewhat mooted. We are between a rock and a hard place in the matter of the imprisonment and false arbitrary detention of the two Michaels. It's a delicate geopolitical moment. But the real issue has been the fact that the international community have been bystanders and enablers of what has been a pattern of, and I use the word CCP, the Communist Party, not the Chinese people. We want to distinguish between the government and its people who are the targets of their oppression. But we have been witnessing now a state-orchestrated pattern of repression respecting the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, the Falun Gong, the Hong Kong, the Taiwanese, that has been going on now for 20 years. The time has come to hold China to account in the court of public opinion, if not in courts themselves.
How do you go about doing that?
Well, what I think we can do is, number one, we should make sure that our multilateral institutions, like the United Nations, like the WHO, are not maneuvered or corrupted with respect to the CCP agenda. Let me give you one example. That just 10 days ago, China was appointed to a panel, a UN human rights panel that appoints the UN human rights experts in the areas of freedom of expression, arbitrary detention, health, and the disappeared. You can't make these things up. The four major violations that are now, and that led to the pandemic, are now allowing China to be elected to a human rights panel to choose the UN special rapporteurs, read those issues.
There have been concerns raised over just how much influence China might have with the WHO. Do you think that China should be allowed to remain in the WHO after all of this, and should they be held accountable?
Well, you know, the United Nations and our institutions is part of our DNA. And we always have seen the United Nations as the important, which it is, institution that warrants our support. So I think there was, at the beginning, you know, a kind of indulgence of the WHO because of our indulgence of UN institutions, generally speaking. It's time for Canada to revisit our involvement with these UN institutions. We need to be supporters of them, but we have to hold them accountable like the WHO. Otherwise, willy-nilly, we will be indulging in acquiescence ourselves in information which might be false, misleading, and dangerous.
What do you think of President Trump's decision to cut funding from the WHO over the China controversy?
I do believe that the WHO, as I mentioned, along with other institutions, has to be held accountable. Regrettably, President Trump is not the person to have the credibility to engage in this initiative. He himself, in terms of his presidential leadership under this, began with denial, led to delay, led to dysfunction, led to him engaging in attacks on the media and others as this being false news. So he's not the most credible figure, even if he may be doing the right thing. I would much prefer there to be a multilateral group of the community of democracies that seeks to hold the WHO to account.
How do you think that Prime Minister Trudeau should proceed?
Well, I think the Prime Minister at this point is concentrating on what is the best priorities and policies with regard to protecting the Canadian people at this point from the ravages of this pandemic which reached our shores. I think we will have to do a rethink when this matter is over and begin to ask ourselves, what are the initiatives we can take? For example, I think we should be applying Magnitsky sanctions and targeting the specific individuals in China that have been responsible for the suppression of the truth and for the arrest and imprisonment and disappearances of doctors and dissidents. We've applied Magnitsky sanctions to Russia, to South Sudan, to Myanmar, to Venezuela, but we've not yet applied any sanctions to China. By doing so, we allow them to, in fact, not be held accountable and maybe indulge their impunity.
Some say the virus would have spread no matter what, and that it's unfair to blame China in all of this. What would you say to them?
I don't know if it would have spread, but I do know, as scientific publications have shown, that 95% of it would not have spread. And all the authoritative scientific evidence is that this could have been halted at the beginning if the truth were not suppressed, if those who tried to sound the alarm were not imprisoned, and the like. So it does bear accountability. In fact, as we are speaking, the leadership in China is seeking to censor scientific publications which are seeking to still report on the pandemic then and now.
Erwin Kotler, thank you for joining us.
Good speaking with you, and thank you for having me.
Coming up, Do Something, an aptly named book by former Reform Party leader Preston Manning. What is his call for action in this time of crisis?
You're watching the West Block on Global.
There are continuing stories of people who are falling through the cracks, individuals who are not eligible for the programs that have been announced, small and medium-sized business owners who won't be able to qualify for the measures that have been proposed. So we cannot wait until June or the fall before we can get those answers. Parliament must get back to work.
Welcome back. That was Conservative Party leader Andrew Scheer on why he thinks Parliament needs to reconvene right here in Ottawa and in person. Former Reform Party leader Preston Manning argues in his new book, Do Something, that democracy is ailing. And with COVID-19, democracy as we know it may be under siege. Joining me now from Vancouver Island is Preston Manning. Thank you for joining me, Mr. Manning.
Well, thank you for having me.
You've written about democracy being under threat. We're now living in unprecedented times with this COVID-19 pandemic. How do you think our democracy is functioning right now?
What I tried to get into in that book is what I think will be the great ideological competition of the 21st century, which is between citizen-directed democracy as we practice it here versus this state-directed democracy as promoted by the Communist Party and government of China. And I think it's how the two different systems are responding to this coronavirus pandemic is a good test of which one works best and what are the problems with each.
Mr. Manning, how do you think politicians should operate in this time? What would your advice be to Canadian politicians about how to ensure there's transparency and democratic accountability without essentially politicizing a pandemic?
Well, I think the less partisanship there is, the better. One of the practical things that I think could have been done in Canada, there's a gap between the political community and the science community. Very few scientists will ever run for public office. Very few political people have any kind of a science background. And if you're going to base your response on science, the more that can be done to reduce that gap and to reduce it before there's ever an immediate crisis, the better.
What do you think about the Trudeau government's decision to essentially put public health in charge? They're saying we're listening to the scientists and the experts on when things can happen and when the economy should reopen. Do you think that that's the responsible way forward, or do you think politicians are devolving their responsibility as the elected officials?
Well, I think there's a place for that, but again, I think that the handling of the crisis would be better if this relationship was established long before there was a crisis. I mean, many of these political figures didn't know they had an epidemiologist or a virologist in their circle of associations until this crisis occurred. I do think the other weakness in the Canadian response is that while the entire focus is on the health side, there's very little focus on what the financial or economic consequences of some of these health decisions are. And we'd be better off if those were integrated rather than handled separately.
What do you think the best way is to have accountability for government right now? Is it to have that immediate sitting with Parliament and the opposition, having regular question periods, or do you think that the government essentially does its thing now and there's accountability later through some sort of royal commission or investigation into how the government handled things?
Well, I think the key to accountability is, first of all, transparency in whatever the government is doing, and the public as well as the opposition has an opportunity to scrutinize it. But I think there has to be ongoing accountability, that you can't let the government do whatever it wants to do and then 3 months or 6 months later come back to evaluate that.
What are your concerns, Mr. Manning, about Canadian democracy as we navigate through this time of COVID-19?
Well, I think that some of the difficulties we're having gets to a bigger problem than the need to raise the knowledge and skill level of our political class generally. When I got out of the Parliament, I had this relationship with the International Liaison Department of the Communist Party of China that I acquired when I was in the Parliament, and I contacted those officials afterwards and said, I'd like to visit your training facilities for your top political people in China. And to my surprise, they actually complied with that. And I visited 3 of these major training facilities for the political class in China, one in Beijing, one in Shanghai, and one in Shenzhen. And they have these campuses with buildings and lecture halls and think tanks and enormous complexes for training their political people. They have to have training at the municipal level, the state level. If they ever want to get up to the higher levels, they had to have training. 20% of it was military training, 20% of it was state-directed capitalism. And when you compare the energy and the investment that they make in preparing their political people for state-directed democracy with how little we do of that, I think one of the conclusions I came to is that we have to vastly increase our investment and commitment to training of our political people so that we're better equipped to handle issues and crises like the pandemic crisis.
Mr. Manning, your father was a very prominent Canadian politician, but also a rancher, and I understand he had a story that gave advice on how to get through tough times using the example of prairie buffalo. Can you tell us what that is?
Well, the old ranchers in Alberta will tell you there's a difference between how cattle react to a storm and how buffalo react. The cattle tend to turn tail and run in front of the storm, run away from it, try to get away from it, whereas buffalo will turn into it. And they've got that massive front end, but by turning into the storm, they actually get out of it faster than running in front of it. And I think there's a lesson in that for political people and for Canadians generally. You don't run away from a storm, you turn into it and you face it, and you'll get out of it sooner by doing that.
Wise words. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Manning.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us. For the West Block, I'm Mercedes Stephenson. Stay safe and look after each other.